The Nestlé Corporation is the largest food and beverage company on Earth, synonymous with global brands, mass consumption, and unparalleled corporate power. Its empire was founded in 1866 by Nestlé, who invented Lact, the world's first infant cereal, as a humanitarian miracle to save children who could not breastfeed, launching a global dynasty built on the promise of good food, good life. For over 150 years, the corporation has shaped global nutrition and consumer habits, controlling over 2,000 brands from Nescafé and Kit Kat to Prairie, operating in 186 countries and generating over $105 billion in annual revenue. Despite its humanitarian origins, the company's history is marked by dark and persistent controversies, including the infamous Nestlé Kills Babies boycott of the 1970s, persistent allegations of child slave labor in its cocoa supply chain, the privatization of public water sources, and the sale of tainted food to millions. Was Henri Nestlé a humanitarian or a reluctant capitalist? The founder, Henri Nestlé, was born Heinrich Nestlé in 1814 in Frankfurt, Germany, into a family of merchants and significantly glassmakers. He was the 11th of 14 children in a respectable middle-class family. He was a man of the Industrial and Scientific Revolution. He trained as a pharmacist's assistant in Germany, a trade that at the time was a hybrid of chemistry, botany, and medicine. In 1833, as a young, ambitious man, he left Germany. The reasons, according to company history, were political. His family was reportedly involved in liberal revolutionary circles, and the conservative German political climate was becoming dangerous. He settled in the small, neutral French-speaking Swiss town of Vive on the shores of Lake Geneva. He changed his name to the French Enril, and in 1843 set up his own small business. He was not at first a food producer. He was a classic 19th-century chemist and tinkerer. Using his pharmaceutical knowledge, he produced and sold a variety of products, nut oils, lure, vinegar, and even mineral water. He was a small-time local businessman, not an industrialist, but the world around him was gripped by a massive tragic crisis: infant mortality. In mid-9th century Europe, cities were exploding. Industrialization was drawing millions from the countryside into crowded, unsanitary urban slums. For new mothers in this environment, breastfeeding was often impossible. Many were malnourished themselves or were forced to work 14-hour days in factories, separated from their infants. The alternatives were grim. Wet nursing was expensive and unregulated. Animal milk was dangerous. It was often unpasteurized, contaminated with tuberculosis or other bacteria, and nutritionally indigestible for a newborn's delicate stomach. The result was a slaughter. In many European cities, the infant mortality rate was as high as 25%. 1 in 4 babies did not live to see their first birthday, with malnutrition and gastrointestinal diseases being the primary killers. Enrelé, the chemist, saw this not just as a tragedy, but as a scientific problem to be solved. He began experimenting. His goal was to create a perfect infant food, a product that was stable, safe, and crucially digestible. He used his knowledge of chemistry to break down the components. He started with good Swiss cow's milk. He added sugar for carbohydrates. And in a moment of genius, he added wheat flour that had been baked to remove the indigestible starch. This combination of milk, sugar, and processed flour was the first infant cereal, a product he called Fine Lact. In 1867, he tested his new invention. According to company legend, his first customer was a premature infant who was near death, unable to tolerate his mother's milk or any other substitute. Nestlé's Fine Lact saved the child's life. This story, which became the core of the company's founding myth, was a marketing masterpiece. Nestlé, the humanitarian scientist, had defeated infant mortality. He adopted his own family's coat of arms, a bird's nest with a mother bird feeding her young, as his logo. It was the perfect symbol of safety, nourishment, and maternal care. The product was an immediate success. In 1868, he was selling 500 cans a year. Within a few years, he was selling 1 million cans a year across Europe. He had created an entire new industry, but Nestlé was competing with another giant. In 1866, the same year Nestlé was perfecting his formula. Two American brothers, Charles and George Page, had also come to Switzerland. They founded the Anglo-Swiss Condensed Milk Company in Cham. Their product was different. Condensed milk, a thick, sweet, shelf-stable product aimed at adults. For the next decade, the two companies, Nestlè's infant food and Anglo-Swiss's condensed milk, were fierce rivals. This early rivalry was, according to some historical reports, where the darker side of the Nestlé business culture first appeared. The company was accused of anti-competitive practices of trying to steal formulas or poach clients from rivals like the German company Liebig. But these were at the time standard rough-and-tumble business tactics. Orenlay himself, however, was not a robber baron. He was an inventor who had become a reluctant industrialist. He was 60 years old, wealthy, and tired of the stresses of a global business he had never intended to create. And like his own father, he had no children to inherit the empire. In 1875, in a move that showed he was a scientist, not a dynast, he sold the entire company, his factory, his formula, and his name to a group of Swiss businessmen for 1 million francs. It was a massive fortune. Henri Nestlé retired to a quiet life of local philanthropy, funding a hospital in Vet, and died in 1890, long before the company bearing his name would become a global controversy. The new owners, however, had no such reservations. They were not humanitarians. They were capitalists. They immediately began an aggressive global expansion, pushing the Nestlé-branded infant formula into new markets, including the colonial territories of Africa and Asia. This was the company's original sin. In the 1890s and early 1900s, Nestlé sales agents, often dressed as milk nurses, began to penetrate these developing regions. They marketed their scientific product to poor, often illiterate mothers as a modern, safer alternative to breast milk. This marketing, critics would later argue, laid the foundation for the humanitarian disaster that would explode in the 1970s. It was the first instance of the company allegedly prizing profit over the health of the most vulnerable infants, a charge that would come to define its legacy. From Nescafé to the Meiji Empire in 1905, the great rivalry that had defined the Swiss milk industry ended. The Nestlé company, now run by professional managers like Louis Dapples, merged with its old competitor, the Anglo-Swiss Condensed Milk Company. This merger created a massive new entity, the Nestlé and Anglo-Swiss Condensed Milk Company. This new combined firm was a global powerhouse with factories in the U.S., Britain, Germany, and Spain. The company's growth was supercharged by war. Just as Herbert Dow had profited from World War I, Nestlé's new combined entity became a primary supplier of processed milk and chocolate to the armies of Europe. This created a new controversy. Switzerland was famously neutral, but Nestlé was a multinational. It owned factories in both Germany and in Allied countries. Throughout World War I and later World War II, Nestlé operated with a pragmatic neutrality that critics saw as profiteering from both sides. They supplied condensed milk and their new milk chocolate to the German and Austro-Hungarian armies. At the same exact time, they were supplying their other factories to the British, French, and later American armies. The U.S. government became a massive customer, ordering millions of cans of condensed milk and chocolate as field rations for its soldiers. Nestlé, as a neutral Swiss company, was playing both sides, raking in profits from the conflict. This reputation as a war profiteer was a charge that would stick, adding to the company's growing image as a corporation with no loyalty other than to its own bottom line. This era also saw the company's second great innovation, one that would become even more profitable than infant formula. In 1938, on the eve of another world war, a Nestlé scientist named Max Morgenthaler was tasked with solving a problem for the Brazilian government, which had a massive surplus of coffee beans. The result of his research was Nescafé. Nescafé was the world's first truly successful instant coffee. By freeze-drying the coffee, Nestlé had created a product that was lightweight, had an almost infinite shelf life, and required only hot water. It was another miracle product, and once again, its first and most important customer was the military. The U.S. government, upon entering World War II, bought Nestlé's entire Nescafé production, including it in every soldier's sea rations. By the end of World War II, the company that Ryle had founded was unrecognizable. It was a global giant. Its growth fueled by 2 world wars. It had a portfolio of iconic products. Fine lacked Nestlé's milk chocolate and the new global phenomenon Nescafé. In the post-war boom, the company, now led by a new generation of professional non-family managers, embarked on a massive campaign of acquisition. This was the strategy that would build the modern NLE. In 1947, they bought Maggi, the Swiss company famous for its instant soups and seasonings, giving them a foothold in the savory market. In 1950, they bought Cross and Blackwell, a venerable British food company. In 1929, they had already absorbed the great Swiss chocolate companies Peter, Kahler, and Kohler. The company was becoming an unstoppable conglomerate, diversifying out of its core milk business into every corner of the food industry. But the core of its business, the product that had started it all, infant formula, was about to become the source of the greatest scandal in its history. A scandal that would forever tarnish the Motherbird logo and lead to the global decades-long cry, "Nestlé kills babies," the deadly marketing campaign. The problem for Nestlé was that by the 1960s, the infant formula market in Europe and North America was saturated and worse, shrinking. In the developed world, a new post-war back-to-nature movement was emerging. Scientific and medical consensus was shifting decisively back to breastfeeding. Doctors and hospitals were encouraging mothers to reject the scientific bottle in favor of the natural breast. For Nestlé, this was a demographic and financial disaster. Their solution was to find a new market, a market that was not contaminated by this new medical advice. They targeted the developing nations of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. This was a blue ocean opportunity. These regions had exploding post-sea colonial populations, high birth rates, and a deep-seated aspirational desire for modern Western products. Nestlé, along with other companies like the American Ross and Bristol-Myers, launched one of the most aggressive and, as critics would soon prove, unethical marketing campaigns in corporate history. The strategy, documented by health organizations and later by the World Health Organization, was a systematic campaign to undermine the practice of breastfeeding and create an artificial dependency on Nestlé's formula. The first and most insidious tactic was the use of milk nurses. Clear's throat, Nestlé would hire thousands of local women, dress them in white nurse-like uniforms, and send them directly into the maternity wards of hospitals and clinics in Nigeria, Kenya, Brazil, and the Philippines. These milk nurses, who were in reality sales representatives on commission, would give advice to new mothers. They would tell them with the full authority of a medical professional that the modern way was better, that their breast milk was insufficient or low quality, and that a scientific product was the best way to ensure their baby's health. The second tactic was the distribution of free samples. These milk nurses would hand out free single-serving packets of Nestlé formula, often enough for the first few days of the baby's life. This was a diabolically effective hook. A new mother given these free samples would feed them to her baby. After a few days of not breastfeeding, her own milk supply would naturally begin to dry up. By the time the free samples ran out, her body could no longer produce milk. She was now physiologically dependent on the product. She had become a permanent paying customer, trapped. The third tactic was mass media advertising. Nestlé billboards and radio jingles blanketed these countries, all showing plump, healthy, smiling Nestlé babies. a stark aspirational contrast to the poverty and malnutrition that was rampant. They associated their product with Western modernity, health, and success. This three-pronged campaign was a massive commercial success. Nestlé's sales of infant formula in the developing world exploded, becoming a primary driver of the company's 1970s growth, accounting for a huge portion of its profits. But the human cost was a holocaust. The marketing campaign was built on two fatal and, in many cases, deliberate lies. The first lie was that formula was safer than breast milk. In reality, in the developing world, it was a death sentence. The second lie was that the mothers in these countries could use the product safely. The problem was water. Nestlé's formula was a powder. It had to be mixed with water, but the vast majority of Nestlé's new trapped customers lived in rural villages and urban slums that had no access to clean portable water. They were mixing the expensive scientific formula with water from contaminated rivers, wells, and ditches. Water often teeming with cholera, typhoid, and dysentery. The very product that was marketed as health was now the primary delivery mechanism for fatal waterborne diseases. The second problem was literacy. The instructions on the cans were often written in English, French, or German languages the local mothers could not read. Even if they could read, the complex sterilization procedures, boiling the water, the bottles, and the nipples for 10 minutes, were almost impossible to follow for a family living in a one-room hut with a single pot and a limited, expensive supply of firewood or charcoal. The third and most brutal problem was poverty. The formula was ruinously expensive. A single can could consume 20 to 30% of a family's entire weekly income. Mothers desperate to feed their babies, but unable to afford the full amount, would try to stretch the product. They would over-dilute the formula, mixing 1 scoop of powder with twice or even 3 times the required amount of water. The result of this toxic combination, contaminated water and over-diluted formula, was a public health catastrophe known as the infant formula cycle. A baby fed over-diluted formula would be chronically undernourished. This marasmus, or severe malnutrition, would cause the child to become weak and emaciated.